I want to welcome you to the Canmore Opera House. When I started at Heritage Park in 2008, it wasn't very long before I started to hear stories about some of the weird things that happen around the park. And one of the places that I was told about a lot was the Opera House. Not very many people like to work in there alone. So banquet staff and housekeeping staff would mention how it gave them the creeps because sometimes they'd be downstairs cleaning and they would hear footsteps on the upstairs, but there'd be nobody up there. They'd hear people going down the stairs when they were on the main floor. Just all kinds of strange noises. Long, long history of strange things happening in the park, one of the most active places in the park. But let me tell you first a little bit about this opera house. I mentioned it's the Canmore Opera House because it was built in Canmore in the late 1890s and it opened in the summer of 1898 as a rehearsal hall for the H.W. McNeil Brass Band. That was the miners' band. So in the mining town of Canmore, like all mining towns, the men got together and the women and their everything too. They were looking for entertainment between the shifts, things to do. So a lot of the miners got together and made this brass band, but they needed a place to rehearse. So they built themselves a log rehearsal hall. Well, it wasn't very long before this became a very popular place in town. It was a good sized hall, so it became the place for dances, and it became the place for shows, for roving troops to come through and entertain, for plays. Even a national opera company came, the British National Opera Company, and a Welsh international choir came and sang there. It became so famous that actually Jack Benny and Ginger Rogers even visited when they were in Banff in the early days of Hollywood, came out to Canmore to see the only log opera house in the world in its day. So pretty famous place, pretty active place. In 1915, it was converted actually into a theater. It was built double the length, so 200 seats could be put in there, plush seats, electricity added, and it became a movie theater. Of course, it was silent movies at first, and then it was turned into the talkies over time, and it operated until the 1960s in Canmore when it was finally closed about 1960 and left vacant for a while, and then it was donated to Heritage Park. And right when Heritage Park opened, the Opera House was a key feature of the park, up on top of the hill where the windmill stands, where the old park gates were, the beautiful view of the mountains out in front of it. It became the home for Alberta Theatre Projects, a new company in Calgary at the time, and this was their home. They put on hundreds of plays in this opera house, and they talked a lot over time about strange things that would happen in the opera house. Well, let's go inside and I'll tell you one of those stories. Now, in the early 1970s, Rick Smith came to work at the park as a general manager. He's well known for this park for many, many years. He was here. In those early days, he started to hear stories about the Opera House, stories about the other buildings, stories of strange happenings in the park. Now, it had only been open since '64, so things have happened in this park for a long time. And he didn't really know what to make of them, as many people don't. And he was at a function in the Opera House one night on some kind of production, and he was sitting in the audience with his date. And they were sitting somewhere around the third row and back in the audience, and there's a seat there that they never would sell, the third seat in the third row in those early days, because there was a person that the actors would often say that they would see when they were in here. Somebody that they would see sort of out of the corner of their eye in the back of the stage when they were rehearsing, occasionally up in the booth where the techies were, and sometimes when they were rehearsing, that person would sit out in the audience and watch them. He was a little old man that never said anything, never did anything when he was sitting in the audience watching the rehearsals, but always sat in the third seat in the third row, third seat in. Now, sometimes during rehearsals, props would move around up on the stage, or sometimes between rehearsals, when they'd go downstairs for a break, having left everything out, they'd come back up and find things were moved around. So Rick was talking to his date about these different things that the actress had always told him about the opera house. And he said, I'd like to believe them, but until I see it for myself, I can't really believe it. And just at that moment, as they looked up at the stage, the curtain moved a little bit, as though by a touch of wind. And Rick knew there was no air vents, no kind of movement of air coming into this place that should move that curtain. So he laughed and he said, well, maybe that's the spirit right now saying they're here. And he just made a joke about it. And they watched the production, and halfway through, of course, there was an intermission. And he and his date went downstairs. And the old location, it had a big downstairs where you would go for intermission for coffee and drinks. They went downstairs to have a cup of coffee, and they were standing at a table about 20 feet or more away from the downstairs area where they had come down. And they're just talking and chatting over their coffee when they looked over at the staircase. And there on the staircase was a small man. He was dressed in a tweed coat with a brown shirt without a collar, with black pants and tall brown boots, and a hat, sort of like a Mountie Stetson on his head, but not quite as hard as that, so a little bit more floppy, with a beard, a short beard. He looked about 60, 70 years old, not very big, and he looked directly at Rick and his date. And Rick said to his date, "Do you see that?" And his date said, "Yes, I do." And at that moment, two people came walking down the stairs, and they walked right through him. Rick looked at his date, and "Did you see that?" So I did, and the and they looked again, and the man looked right at him, and then he turned around and walked back up the stairs, and Rick bounded across the room and raced up the stairs after him and looked all over, and he was gone. Rick came back to his date, and he said, "He's too old to have moved that fast," and he never could find him again. And maybe he started to believe at that point.